This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Now, this is a fun introduction to do. Why? Because I get to say this. My guest today is a self-made billionaire. Now, how cool is that? That's the goal that we all dream about. And my guest today, Tom Golisano, the founder of the payroll processing company Paychex, has made it happen. You know, in this day and age where it sounds like hard work and good ideas are not all that, it's so damn refreshing to jump in and have a conversation with a guy who truly started at the bottom and made it happen. And you know, before you hear Tom talk, there's going to be some lesson, some nugget, something that can assist your life. Perhaps it's just that aha moment of understanding how he thinks about something. That's what we all need. We need the experience from others. We need the insight from others, those that have walked ahead of us, that have gone down the path. And as I said from the top, it just so happens that Tom has one of those fantastic success stories that makes you stop and pay attention. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my guest today, Tom Golisano, and gain a little wisdom. So, Tom, here's where I wanted to start today. There's this controversy out there. There's these evil billionaires that Bernie Sanders are talking about. They should not even exist. Now, in my mind, the idea of being a billionaire has always been very simple American dream. Come up with a great idea, work hard. If you get a little luck on your side, something big will happen. And that's the good thing about America. What's changed?
Well, we got a bunch of people, should we say left of center, that are trying to make a negative deal out of it. Does it bother me? You bet it bothers me. I started Paychex with $3,000 and a couple of credit cards. I lost the credit cards within 3 months because they got retracted. I went 4 years without a paycheck. My family went through bankruptcy while I was in high school. I had to work a year before I went to college. I ended up going to a state college where there was no tuition for a 2-year program. After a couple of jobs, I got the idea for Paychex. I started out small. I had $3,000 when I started. It grew into something over a 50-year period. I think I've paid enough in taxes to have a battleship named after me. I've also been able to, from a philanthropic point of view, hand out over $300 million to various institutions and charities.
Tom, whether it's $500,000 or $1 million or $5 million or $1 billion or whatever, what is taken place in the, let's just say, the American mindset to where you could have this dream, come up with an idea, do something big. Maybe they spend 50 years and they make $1 million. That's still a big deal. Maybe they get a little extra luck and it turns into $4 billion. But what has happened to where this is a negative?
Well, Mike, I don't think you can generalize and say everybody feels that way. I know some number of people feel that way, and usually they, again, like I said, they come from the left. I also don't think our educational system, even at the secondary school level, is doing a good enough job promoting and embracing capitalism. In fact, the more I hear about the educational system, the more I'm convinced I think a lot of educators, even at the college level, put it down all the time rather than promote it and embrace it. So I think that's part of the problem.
Let's keep it there for a second. I remember going to get my MBA, which turned out to be a big waste of time. I remember thinking before I got there, and I guess I was a little naive, I thought, well, I'm going to really learn about being an entrepreneur here. I don't have to tell you what goes on in an MBA program, but you really don't. It's kind of impossible to learn how to be an entrepreneur inside a university, isn't it? Don't you have to do it?
I think you're right. I really think you're right. Fortunately, people at all ages feel the bug, and they're willing to go out and take what they consider a risk to start a venture. And I give those people a lot of credit. But like I said, I think there's too many parts of society that are negative on that. In my book, I talk about, would you rather be an entrepreneur and control your own destiny, or do you think it's safer to work for a big company? Well, I think it's safer to be an entrepreneur because, quite frankly, today, what happens in large corporations, there's so much turnover and so much change that it's not very safe anymore. Excellent example of that is Eastman Kodak in Rochester, New York, which is my hometown. Eastman Kodak in the early 80s had over 60,000 people working for it. It was cradle-to-grave security. Today, they have less than 3,000 people working for the company. That's how much it's changed. Being an entrepreneur, from my perspective, is a lot safer, assuming you could make it viable, than ever working for a company. But I think our educational system is, ever since the early 50s, if I remember right, tried to educate you to be an employee of a large company.
So let me take it back to an early stage. You pick the time. Could be below the age of 10. It could be teenager. How did you learn to believe in yourself? Who taught you? What was your early influence? Because a lot of people don't believe in themselves to go take that risk. They want the steady Eddie job. So what was it about you early in life? What was the trigger? Who inspired you?
Well, there were a few trickles, if you want to use that word. First, my parents, even though they lived in middle-class suburban America, were not well off financially. My father became bankrupt. He had his own business. I didn't get a thing called an allowance or anything like that. When I was a kid, I had all kinds of jobs, everything from collecting newspapers and taking them to the town dump for a few pennies, to having a paper route, to running a skating rink for the town I lived in, to selling tickets at bowling alleys so that people could get early alleys when bowling was at its heyday. So I had to do everything like that when I was a kid to have just a few bucks in my pocket. I remember I saved over $600 at one point, mainly from my paper route. My father, in dire financial straits, borrowed it from me one day. I never thought I'd see it again, and of course I didn't. But then as a teenager, I had an unusual experience with my dad. My dad was in his early 60s. Like I said earlier, he was unsuccessful with his business, but at this point, he was selling macaroni products through a big panel truck for a local distributor of macaroni products in Rochester, New York. For a 60-year-old man, it was a tough job driving a big panel truck and carrying these boxes around. During the summer, I used to help him. Well, one day we were at the depot, so to speak. My father's boss absolutely just chewed him out for whatever reason. I don't remember the reason. I don't even know if it was a good reason. But he embarrassed and humiliated my father. I had to stand there and watch it as a 17-year-old. I just made up my mind at that day, if I was ever in a position, first of all, I'd never treat people that way if I was a leader or a boss in an organization. But secondly, I don't think I ever wanted to be put in that situation. And that meant I should have my own business. And then when I went on to college, I had one key instructor who's still a close friend of mine after 50-some years. He was just a great person, had his own accounting business. He was a great inspiration and really turned me on to the world of business. So that carried over. That was it. When I got out of college, I wanted to have my own business. And I spent maybe 6 or 8 years working for people, looking for an opportunity until I found one.
After college, the working for other people was kind of a way to make ends meet, look for opportunity, but you always knew what you were looking for in terms of running your own show.
Mike, you hit it right on the head. I knew all the time that's what I wanted to do. In fact, myself and even a friend or two of mine, we used to spend evenings daydreaming or night dreaming about what kinds of businesses we could start. For example, you've heard of these homeowners associations where they provide workmen to work in your house. We had that idea back in 1962, but we didn't have the computer and the internet to deal with it like they can do it today. But that's all we concentrated on. That's all I concentrated on. What will it be?
I've seen other folks phrase it this way too, but I love where you go when you talk about passion. I'm a smaller entrepreneur than you, but I've been doing my own thing for 20 plus years. And I've done pretty good at it. But whenever I hear people talk about ideas or they want to be an entrepreneur, they're always talking about, I want to find my passion. I want to find my passion. And you know, I'm going to let you run with this. it's not necessarily about passion. It's about finding something that works. And then when you find something that works, you become passionate about that.
Exactly. My feeling is that passion comes from building an organization. Let's assume you have a product that can be profitable and will be profitable. Then the thing is to build an organization to promote that product and to grow that company. That's the passion, wanting to grow something. Not so much, I mean, how can you get excited about payroll processing?
Well, come on, that sounds, everyone's thinking that, right? But it's true. I mean, how do you get this across? Look, you mentor, you talk to a lot of people. So the typical young person comes into your field of view. Maybe they don't know anything about you, and you start to give them some inspiration. You immediately realize that perhaps you're butting up against the educational system that young person has gone through. And again, let's say they don't know anything about you. How do you win them over to your way? One of your first steps to breaking that wall down to get them over to the Tom way?
Well, I had to do that in 17 different examples. After I started Paychex in the early days, after about 4 years, I had the opportunity to sell a franchise and also to get involved in a partnership. After I got these two people involved, I then started recruiting people to go to various cities from around the country. Most of them lived in Rochester, went to different cities around the country and started Paychex. And the way I tried to encourage them to do it was selling them on the idea that having a successful business is far more secure and safe than ever working for somebody. You know, when you work for somebody, you could do a really good job, but your boss could be sort of indifferent and not help your career. Or secondly, your boss and you could be really good together, but the division is terrible. And then, of course, you can take it to the extreme. The division could be doing really well, but other parts of the company are not doing well. So you end up in a career void or negative situation. So to me, that's very risky. The other thing about risk, you can't sell your job. If you get disabled, you're not going to probably do very well. But if you have your own business, you can sell it, you can pass it on to an heir, maybe survive decently if you become physically or mentally disabled. Those were the techniques I used. And then, of course, maybe a few of them you would say they were kind of smart-assy, had a chip on their shoulder, and I think that helped.
Let me give a big picture philosophical question. I started my business career 1995, so right when the internet hit, right when Netscape went public. If you had to look back, how would have Paychex unfolded differently if the communication of today was like it was when you started? Would it have made a change? How do you think that would have affected your starting Paychex?
I don't think it would have very much. I mean, because the basis of Paychex is that it's a complex endeavor for a small employer. For example, if you're a New York State employer, there's a minimum of 52 payroll tax returns and payments that must be filed every year. Penalties are severe if you don't do it exactly to standard. I don't think that would have affected us. In fact, it might have made our life a little easier because right now we started out having all our clients' input come in from the telephone. Today, about 40% come in different methods, the internet, faxes, mail, and so forth. It probably wouldn't have had much effect on Paychex. Maybe it would have escalated our growth a little faster.
Let me take it to the beginning of Paychex. Let you explain the genesis of the idea, because this is, I think, not necessarily that people are going to go out and try and replicate Paychex, but it's the process that you went through to analyze opportunity and then break out. Where would you say was the first trigger for Paychex that you knew, okay, we're going this direction?
One of my early jobs, in fact, the job just before I started Paychex, was with a payroll processing company in Rochester. Traditional payroll processors back in those days, in the early 70s, focused on large companies. By large, I mean 50, 100 employees, up to 500 or 1,000 employees. I was a salesperson and a sales manager for that organization, enjoying my job. One day I was just driving down the road, though, realized that most employers, most businesses have less than 50 employees in the United States. I went to the library, verified that, found out 95% have 50 employees or less. I came up with this concept about how to deal with that marketplace, which was quite different from the way the traditional payroll processors process. And that 3 points were: one, our clients for the larger companies had to fill out complex computer input sheets which were picked up and then keystroke from that. The client had to learn how to use that computer input sheet, and it was also error prone. Second thing is, the first thing, why not have the clients call in on the telephone? If you're a 15-person firm, rather than learn how to do that input sheet, what if you could just call in on the phone and have the employees' names read to you, and you just tell us how many hours to pay them, and if they have any changes in rates or addresses or anything like that, you give it to us right over the phone. You have a professional on our end of the line to do the work. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, 52 payroll tax returns must be filed every year in the state of New York, and most states are around that number. Well, why not do the payroll tax returns for the clients? The other payroll processors, the traditional payroll processors, weren't doing that. They were giving them reports to the client that would facilitate those tax returns, but they weren't actually doing them, so there was a void there. Third, we had to price it so small companies could afford it. A traditional payroll processor back in 1971, for example, would have a minimum charge of $24 a pay period. Well, if you only got 3 or 5 employees, that's a pretty heavy number back in those days. Our pricing started out at roughly $1 a check. So that was sort of the beginning. But here's the key, and this is a real key. Most payroll processors charge by the number of payroll checks they write. In other words, if you have 100 employees, you're going to get 100 payroll checks or salary deposit. You're going to be charged, and this is just roughly 50 cents a check. Well, if you're a 10-person payroll being processed by Paychex, you're going to pay about $1 a check or $10. The end result of this is if you do 10-person payrolls, your revenue is 2.5 times larger than your 100-person payroll. Now, here's the good thing. I think it's easier to sell 10 10s than 100 because all your competition is chasing those larger companies. And also, if you happen to lose one, it's not the end of the world. If you lose a client and it's a 100-person client, and you really feel it more than you would the other way. Those were the genesis of Paychex. The 3 things we did to the service and the fact that the profitability, and that's why our profitability, I don't know if you looked at our financial statements, but our profitability before tax is in the mid to high 30s, which is pretty darn good.
By this stage of the game, 50 years into the payroll business, you know all the players. You've had a chance to communicate with all the players. A pretty big oversight that the traditional payroll players back in the early 70s did not see the insight that you saw. Now, have any of those folks, without picking on them or naming their names, have any of those folks ever sat down and shared with you? I assume they have. Like, hey, Tom, you had a pretty good insight and we really screwed up by letting you come into existence.
Well, nobody physically admitted it, but emulation is the sincerest form of flattery. Now everybody goes after the low end of the market. Even automatic data processing, which is the grandfather of our industry, was really started up handling just large companies. But now they're in our marketplace, and several other companies are in our marketplace. Nobody's come to me and said, gee, nice job, Tom. Wish we had thought of that.
I mean, that's the most obvious thing to me as an outsider. I look at it and it's like you just saw an arbitrage, a massive arbitrage that no one else was seeing.
Well, that and one other thing. We picked a marketplace that was huge. I mean, how many millions of businesses are in the United States? If you're an employer, even with one employee, you have a burden as an unpaid tax collector to deal with your federal and sometimes your state governments as a tax collector. It's not a lot of fun. Nobody likes to see those envelopes with the yellow eagle on them coming from the Internal Revenue.
Let me go to a big picture business philosophical point, which you put in your work, which I love. It's 100% true. I don't know how many MBAs or entrepreneurs necessarily think of it as this simple, but nothing happens until there's a sale. Until a customer gives you money, nothing's happening.
That's exactly right. And I'll tell you my experience working with entrepreneurs at all levels, their inability to forecast properly is generally because they can't make the sales and sales presentations that they think they're going to make. In other words, you hang up your shingle and you think the world's going to come to you. It doesn't. It certainly doesn't. Whenever I hear of a company that has, they say, a cash flow problem, they'll walk into a bank and say, I have a cash flow problem, I need to borrow some money. They generally don't have a cash flow problem. They have a sales problem. They're not selling their product enough and bringing in enough revenue to cover their overheads and their cash needs. So I agree with you a whole 100%. Sales and sales management is a key ingredient of any small business or even large business.
Now, also to put that in context, people can go look at a Wikipedia entry and see you today. But when you started, sales, sometimes to get the ball rolling and get that exponential growth, doesn't happen out of the gate. Why don't you give some of the numbers about where your sales were looking 3, 4, 5 years into the business? And I mean, this wasn't massive by any stretch, but you stuck with it.
Well, when I started the company and I had that $3,000, I used it to send out a direct mail piece to businesses in my community. I was hoping to get 60 clients because that's what I needed to break even. Well, I sent out those 3,000 pieces of mail and I got 6 clients. Now, I continued selling the rest of that year just by myself, and I ended up with 40 clients. But over a 4-year period, I got it up to 300 clients. That was my first initial goal, 300 clients in Rochester, New York. Today, Paychex sells 2,000 clients a week, 2,000 clients a week, to show you how the company has developed over the decades. We have 2,500 people on the sales force selling products directly to our client base.
When you talk about your business, and I listen to you talk about it and the growth that it's had over time, maybe it didn't occur as quickly as some of the quote .com companies have done, but you kind of found that Facebook-like moat in a way. I mean, you put yourself in a position in a business opportunity where as it's unfolded, how do you feel about your moat? When you talk about the growth that you're talking about and the way new clients come in, to me, that just is, without even looking at all the financials, that sounds like it's one of those great business stories of having a defendable moat around the business.
We went public in 1983. We sort of had a resolution within the company that we were going to be as predictable and consistent as we could be. When setting our annual goals for sales and client retention and so forth, we built that in every year. We felt it was just very, very important to be predictable to Wall Street. And if we did that, our stock price would be reflective in it. It genuinely has happened. Paychex has had a level of consistency. I think there's only 1 year, and that was during the 2008 debacle, that Paychex earnings didn't grow. They've grown every year. In fact, we had a 10-year period in the 90s where our revenue never grew less than 17%, nor our profitability less than 30%. We had a 10-year straight record accomplishing that.
To add to your book, though, you've got a comment that's exactly what you're saying. Focus on what's important, not what's shiny.
Exactly. Consistency and predictability for a public company is very, very important, in my opinion.
I hope you don't mind me jumping you around here. You got so much great information in the book. The book, Built Not Born, which definitely speaks to that deliberate practice, definitely speaks to the idea that nurture wins over nature. I mean, yes, some people might inherit it and all that, but you are laying out the case that to everyone, if you do your homework, if you prepare and you get into the game, you've got a shot. If you don't do anything, you don't have a shot.
It's interesting you say that. One of the themes I tried to put into the book is that on any given day, everybody has a certain level of entrepreneurial skill. I really believe, though, with education and training and proper methods, that you can take an entrepreneur who may be at a 3 level and make them a 5, or somebody that's a 5 and make them a 7, and somebody that's an 8, make them a 10. Everybody can grow studying entrepreneurism. You don't have to own your own business to be useful in somebody else's business as an entrepreneur.
As you've laid out, you've got a business that's, I guess some people could say, well, that's not so sexy or something like that. Now, if I look out the landscape of modern business, there was a company that just attempted to go public called WeWork. It had all kinds of venture capital backing and a really tall guy with long model-like hair. And then the whole thing turned out to be kind of a ruse. I think I could even go as far as to say as a scam. How do you feel when you see these kinds of businesses, given that you've got this very steady Eddie style of approach, and then you see all these folks that are out there in modern Wall Street just doing things that give everyone a bad name?
Well, it's too bad because you do see them occasionally. Again, our thought process in focusing on predictability and consistency really paid off for us in the long run. But I understand what you're saying about these overnight sensations. It just don't last. It's interesting. I was talking this over with one of our board members the other day. We went public in 1983, which was the end of a public bubble. A lot of companies had gone public just before us, but the bubble was bursting. And we compared ourselves to 16 other companies that went public about the same time. Out of the 16, only 2 survived, ourselves and another company called Cintas. We look back at that track record. We're very proud of the fact that we're a survivor. We understand a lot of people get burned on Wall Street, invested in these types of organizations that are here today and gone tomorrow.
Let me take you back to something you said in the very beginning of this conversation. Right out of the gate, you were very clear to state how much money you started with. I often hear when people talk about starting businesses, they'll say, well, I don't have any money, or I've got a very small amount of money, or I need all this money to start. Or people that perhaps know more about the venture capital system would say, I can't execute my vision without venture capital. I must go to Sand Hill Road and find the venture capital. Why don't you speak to the idea of starting with money and then expand that into perhaps your views on venture capital, Tom?
Well, we never brought in any capital during the whole history of Paychecks. Anytime somebody exchanged shares, the funds went directly to the shareholder and nothing came into the company. To your point, I've never been a fan of venture capital, quite frankly. The restrictions, the dual purpose, the negotiating skill of venture capitalists doesn't leave a sense of timing for when there's a liquidation, are all so different than what the entrepreneur may have in mind. Consequently, if I can avoid venture capital in some of my investments, I do. But on the other hand, there's a lot of money out there today, and there's a lot of people chasing deals. They're paying, in my mind, ridiculous prices for them.
But what happens if you take that money? It's not necessarily a free lunch, is it? I mean, you're going to have people they're going to kind of own you, aren't they?
They certainly are. There's one company that I was an investor in that was sold to an equity firm out of California. It was a significant deal, $650 million. The new CEO called me up. He used to run our business, and now he's the CEO for this venture-owned company. He called me up and he says, you're not going to believe this. Every week I got to deal with some 28-year-old MBA coming in here and telling me how to run my business. I think that's very common when you're involved with venture people and private equity. They do want to help you run your business. And a lot of times they may be able to help you, but sometimes they could be a hindrance. Either event, sometimes they're a real pain in the neck.
Let me shift you in as we narrow our time down here. Let me shift you into politics. And I want to share a brief story with you. I think you will relate to this. I will be the only interviewer that will say this to you, what I'm going to say. So I'm 51. When I was 21, living outside Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia, about 10 miles from Washington, D.C., I got the bright-eyed idea that I would run for mayor of this community. I ran against a guy who'd been an incumbent for 30 years. He was 72 years old, so I was 21, he was 72. I got killed. It was an interesting experience. It was the first time I had to deal with media and all kinds of stuff like that. But I remember my platform was really simple. I was going after property taxes. I got killed. No one cared. It was the most bizarre thing. I mean, I thought it was so logical. And I actually thought the older guy was very concerned that I had hit on something. But I think in hindsight, even though I kind of looked the part and was kind of a large guy at the time, I got killed. But it was an interesting experience to get involved in local politics and see the taxing situation. And I think across the country, and I'll let you run with this, the taxing situation at the local level can really be not nice.
I'd say you're underestimating it. It could be really terrible. And I'm going to tell you, I'm going to give you my own example. I live in Rochester, New York. I'm now a Florida resident, but I still have a home in Rochester. And upstate New York, compared to market value, we have the highest local taxes in the country. For example, the average real estate owner in upstate New York pays about 4% of their market value in real estate taxes every year. We have some communities as high as 5 or 6%. First of all, it's a big burden with people on fixed incomes. That's why a lot of people end up leaving a state like New York. Secondly, The government in New York thought they would solve the problem by putting a 2% cap on how much real estate taxes could go up in 1 year. Well, to me, it was folly. If they're already up so high compared to other markets in the country, putting a 2% cap, it's going to take 50 to 100 years to make a difference so that we're comparable with other communities. But you're right about one other thing. People don't seem to care as much as they should. I think they think the system is complex. They make it difficult to fight your assessments, at least in upstate New York, and they get discouraged and they vote with their feet too often.
How did this transition happen? What was the similar mindset for you where you're in this business that takes off or eventually takes off, does really well? You then shift running for governor, 94, 98, 2002. That seems like a big shift on paper, but in your mind, was it such a big shift?
Well, no, it wasn't in my mind, because all the years I was running paychecks, I had a file in my desk that every time I read something that I thought was inappropriate, unfair, not legal, I put it in this file. And the file got quite big, all relative to New York State. One day when I was considering getting involved in politics, for me to jump right into it, I thought I was pretty well prepared. In fact, I was in my first campaign 3 weeks and I got called in to debate Mario Cuomo, the great orator. Well, you can bet I was nervous, but I had so much information relative to the state that I did quite well. In fact, he came into my dressing room after the debate and said, "Who the hell are you and where'd you get all that stuff?" I was fairly well prepared. The other thing, debating him was interesting because he was a great orator, and I watched his style, and what he did was come up with short phrases to intimidate and make it difficult to respond to in his debate. I took from that a lesson, and I created my own, and I'm going to give you the two that I had that were quite effective. He said to me, Mario Cuomo said to me, "Tom, you complain about New York State taxes and so forth, but Paychex has done a heck of a good job in New York State." And my response is, Paychex has done a good job in New York, not because of it, but in spite of it. And that was a shocker to him. He couldn't deal very well with that. The other thing I said was, in New York State, you can get a good high school education, but you got to go to college to get it.
As you look back at all this political experience, and obviously you run for governor of a state like New York, you're very serious about your politics. When you look back on it now, what is the takeaway from observing that political machinations? And look, I started this conversation off talking about Bernie Sanders, and there's some things that I hear Bernie say that, okay, we'd like to get more manufacturing back in the States and stuff like that. I think that's great. I think the idea of, I don't know, taking everyone's money away from people that earned it fairly and squarely is not such a good idea. But what's your takeaway after all these decades of participating, observing politics? What is the current state of America? It sure looks chaotic to me.
Well, the first observation I would make, Mike, is being in business for so many years and then getting involved in politics, there's a huge difference. And the difference to me is obvious. In politics, there's only one winner. Consequently, these politicians or these candidates will say and do bizarre things to see if they can win the position. The great thing about business, you can have several companies, many companies in a particular industry, and you could all be successful. But politicians don't function in that world. They function in a singular winner world, and consequently, they do bizarre things. That today, I think, is the reason we're hearing things like single-payer health care and open borders and all those types of things. They're looking for bizarre things to try to get people's attention. Do they really need them? Boy, I'd feel very sad if they did beat them. But they do say things and they do things to do whatever they can to win a post.
But there's got to be quite a few people in America right now that are a little bit concerned when some of the major politicians that could end up being president start talking about, I think I've heard Elizabeth Warren talking about literally over 100% tax. I mean, this has got to cause people a little bit of concern.
Well, I'm certainly in that category. I don't believe she can get it through Congress, even if she got elected. But it's possible, I suppose. Hopefully, reality and practicality will settle in, and those types of things won't happen.
Well, I think it's nice to hear you say that because we all get caught up in the headlines, and you've got a little bit more experience than most of us. So it's nice to hear that kind of pragmatic, down to earth, like, okay, don't read all the headlines too much. As we wind down, let me shift you to something that I really think is great that you put forward in your book. And I think it's an entrepreneur that's just starting or trying to figure something out. You talk about questioning every business that you see. That is such a simple idea, but it's so bold and so just, wow, if one can do that, just observe everything they see, how can you not find ideas?
That's exactly right. I always thought it was one of the best ways to find opportunities. But just to go in, take a look at a business, even if you just sit outside and watch the number of people that go in the door, multiply that times the average revenue per sale and all that type of thing, and then speculate on their overhead, you can come to a pretty good decision as to whether or not a business has a real opportunity. It's also fun to do. I promote that concept whenever I can. I have grandchildren that are reaching 20s and 30s years of age. I've kind of put that in their mind for a long time, and I keep pressing them on it, that they should do that every time they walk into a business or observe a business.
Taking also from your work, your thinking, your philosophy, you don't have to like the business idea at first. You just have to see the potential. That's another golden one to just really think about. Don't get caught up in your personal feelings, but see the potential. Be objective and factual about the potential.
Reality is the key word. It's almost dismaying to have entrepreneurs come to me with these projections of sales volume and profitability volume that are just so far out of reality. They'll write up a business plan and they say, well, it's a $10 billion industry. Well, what percentage of that industry do you have to get to make a successful venture? And they say, well, just 10% will do it. Well, I can tell you, Paychex has been in existence for 50 years. We're a solid company. We don't even have 10% of the market yet after 50 years. So how these people come into your office and say, oh, we can get 10% of this market? They don't understand the sales problem, and they don't understand the level of competition that's going to come at them.
They're in your office, and they don't even understand your business. If you don't have 10%, and they're in your office talking about getting more than 10%, it seems like a little bit of a disconnect, doesn't it?
It sure does, and it is.
Let me ask you about your influences. We've talked about your parents, but in terms of other business peers, either people that have influenced you directly or people that you admire, can you speak to other business leaders that you have really grown to believe in and really like their philosophy and their way of doing things?
I'm going to answer it from left field, Mike. I've been around small businesses now most of my life and some major businesses. I never really created a mentor relationship with any of the people involved. But what I did create was negative mentors. Having been involved with small businesses and medium-sized businesses, I used to look for what made them successful, what made them fail. Finding out why they failed was more important than finding out why the ones were successful. And I learned more from that exercise than I ever would from a mentor. But there is one individual I'll tell you about. It was in my early 20s. We're sitting around the sales office. I was selling accounting machines at the time. The manager and I got to talking. He says, Tom, if you want, now this is 1965, if you want to make $100,000 a year, all you got to do is find 10 people that can make you $10,000 a year, or 100 people that can make you $1,000 a year. Now, obviously, what he was doing was traditionalizing and purporting the benefits of building an organization, especially a sales organization. So I took that to heart and always remembered it.
Tom, I appreciate you coming on today. Is there anything that I've not touched on that you want to share? The book is Built, Not Born, a self-made billionaire's no-nonsense guide for entrepreneurs. Definitely no nonsense. I think people can hear that in your voice today. But is there anything that I've not touched on that you feel is really important that people should understand beyond just going to read the book?
Well, there is one topic that you didn't bring up, and quite frankly, doing some other interviews, everybody seems to catch on to this one, and that is, what's the story with this conversation about prenups and postnups, prenuptial agreements and postnuptial agreements? I just emphasized in the book they're very, very important. Nothing is sadder than to see a couple break up who have a successful business, and then they're either forced to sell it or take a much lower valuation for it because they have to give a spouse a cash settlement. I just warn people, if you will, if that's the right word, having a prenup or a postnup arrangement is a very good thing to have happen if you can have it.
It's an interesting point because we've all had a chance to observe in the headlines recently that Jeff Bezos had a divorce. Since Amazon seems to be doing okay still, I assume he probably did all the things that you're talking about. But I guess there have been situations, I don't know any off the top of my head, but I know there's been probably many situations where what you're describing has happened, and you must know them personally as well, where that happens, and then all of a sudden the business can really take a hit.
Yeah, well, actually, Amazon being a public company, and he had marketable securities, it made it easy for a settlement. But if the company was private and not liquid, you have a real problem, because then the company's going to have to be sold to make any settlements happen.
One last question. Why did you decide to write the book? What was the galvanizing force? When did you wake up and say, I must do this?
A number of people had come to me over the years and said, Tom, why don't you write a book? Your experience with paychecks can be helpful to people, and your experience with politics and owning a hockey team and philanthropy, you got a lot of good information that you could pass on to people. And I said, that's a good idea. So I started writing with a ghostwriter a autobiography. Got almost 90% through with the autobiography, and I'm talking to a publisher, and the publisher says, Tom, this isn't bad, but you should write a business book first. I said, well, why do you say that? And they said, well, just to get your reputation out there. It probably could be really valuable to a lot of individuals. While I'm talking to them, I'm writing down the table of contents. In other words, coming up with the substance of the book was real easy for me because I've been through it all. It was much easier to write the business book than it ever was to do the autobiography because everything is current.
It's just the rules for business living. If you read your table of contents, I mean, in some ways, it's a little bit of a cheat sheet. When you read your table of contents, you have a very strong idea of where Tom is going to go in the book.
Mm-hmm. I hope so.
The book, Built, Not Born, a self-made billionaire's no-nonsense guide for entrepreneurs. Tom, thanks for coming on. When that autobiography comes out in the future, please let me know. I'd love to have you on and talk and get into the really nitty-gritty.
I'll do that, Michael. Thanks for the interview.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.